The cemetery sat on a hill above Lake Superior, where the wind came off the water with teeth in it, even in October. Harold Evanston made the drive every morning at 7, same as he had for the past 4 months, pulling his old Ford pickup into the gravel lot and walking the familiar path to the granite headstone near the oak tree. Margaret Ann Evanston, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, 1942-24, 61 years of marriage, reduced to 3 lines and a patch of frozen ground. He brought a folding chair now. His knees weren't what they used to be, and standing for an hour in the Michigan cold had put him in bed for 2 days last week. Margaret would have scolded him for that. She'd been scolding him for 50 years about taking care of himself, and he'd been ignoring her for just as long. Old habits. Cold one today, Maggie. He settled into the chair and pulled his coat tighter. 82 years old, and the cold still surprised him every winter like it was something new. Frost on the windows this morning. I thought about you when I scraped it off. Remember how you used to hate that sound? Said it was like fingernails on a chalkboard. The wind answered. Nothing else did. Harold talked to her for an hour, the way he did every day. Told her about the deer he'd seen in the backyard, the letter from the VA that he hadn't opened yet, the phone call from David that he hadn't returned. Their son had been calling every day now, leaving messages that started worried and ended angry. Dad, you need to call me back. Dad, I'm coming up there if you don't answer. Dad, we need to talk about your situation. His situation, like grief was a logistical problem to be solved. He wants to put me in a home, Maggie. Doesn't say it outright, but I can hear it in his voice. Assisted living, he calls it, like I need assistance living. Harold's jaw tightened. I've been living for 82 years without his help. I don't plan to stop now. But that wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. The house was too quiet without her. The bed was too big. He'd burned dinner 3 times last week because he kept forgetting what he was doing, wandering from room to room like he was looking for something he couldn't name. The pills she used to set out for him every morning sat untouched in their bottles because he couldn't remember which ones were which or when he was supposed to take them. He wasn't falling apart. He was just adrift, untethered. 61 years of having someone to anchor him, and now the rope had been cut. The sound of a motorcycle broke through his thoughts, a low rumble that seemed wrong for the season, too cold for riding. Harold turned and watched a Harley pull into the lot, chrome catching the weak October sun. The rider was younger, maybe 40, with a leather vest over a heavy jacket and a beard that needed trimming. He cut the engine and sat there for a moment, looking at the rows of headstones before swinging off and walking into the cemetery. Harold expected him to head for one of the newer sections, where the grass was still raw over fresh graves. Instead, the man walked toward him, not directly, but close enough that it couldn't be coincidence. He stopped about 20 feet away at a headstone Harold had never paid attention to before, and stood there with his hands in his pockets. They stayed like that for 10 minutes, 2 men in a frozen cemetery, not speaking. Finally, Harold broke the silence. You're going to freeze, standing there without a chair. The man glanced over. So will you. I've got a coat. I've got stubbornness. A faint smile crossed the man's face. My ex-wife used to say it was my only consistent quality. Harold snorted despite himself. Maggie said the same thing. 61 years, and she never stopped trying to fix it. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he walked closer and extended his hand. Jake Rennert, Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, Fallujah, 04 and 06. Harold shook it. The grip was firm but not aggressive, a military handshake, the kind that sized you up without challenging you. Harold Evanston, Corporal, 1st Cavalry Division, Korea, 51 to 53. Chosen? The retreat. Coldest I've ever been in my life. Harold gestured at the frozen ground. Until now, maybe. Jake looked at Margaret's headstone. Your wife? 4 months, cancer. The word still felt like a stone in his throat. Pancreatic. By the time they found it, there was nothing to do but wait. I'm sorry. Everybody's sorry. Doesn't change much. Harold heard the bitterness in his own voice and felt a flash of shame. This man hadn't done anything to deserve that. Who are you here for? Jake nodded toward the headstone he'd been standing at. My daughter, Lily. She was 6. Harold's chest tightened. There was no good response to that. Nothing that wouldn't sound hollow or presumptuous, so he just nodded and said nothing. 3 years ago, Jake continued, his voice flat in that way Harold recognized. The way you talked about things too big to feel fully without breaking. Car accident. My fault. I was driving. Jake! I wasn't drunk, wasn't texting, wasn't doing anything wrong. Just a patch of ice and a guardrail that wasn't where I thought it was. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets. Doesn't matter. She's still gone. They stood together in the cold, two men carrying losses that couldn't be compared or measured, only endured. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the oak tree. Harold thought about David's voicemails, about the pills in their bottles, about the silence waiting for him in the house on Maple Street. You want some coffee? He heard himself say. There's a diner in town that doesn't ask questions when you sit too long. Jake looked at him, really looked, the way soldiers did when they were sizing up whether someone could be trusted. Then he nodded. Yeah, coffee sounds good. They walked back to the Horn parking lot together, the old man and the younger one, their breath fogging in the cold air. Harold's pickup was rusted and reliable. Jake's Harley gleamed like it was the only thing he took care of. Follow me, Harold said. It's not far. He pulled out of the lot, watching in his rearview mirror as Jake kicked the bike to life. The rumble followed him down the hill, past the frozen lake, toward the town where everyone knew his name and no one knew what to say to him anymore. Margaret would have liked this man, he thought. She'd always had a soft spot for strays. The diner was warm and nearly empty, and the waitress brought coffee without being asked. They sat in a booth by the window, watching the lake turn gray under the clouds, and didn't say much of anything at all. Sometimes that was enough. Jake came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He didn't explain why, and Harold didn't ask. They fell into a routine without discussing it, meeting at the cemetery at 7, standing at their separate headstones for an hour, then driving to the diner for coffee and eggs. Sometimes they talked. Mostly they didn't. There was a comfort in shared silence that Harold hadn't felt since Margaret died, the particular relief of being with someone who understood that grief wasn't a problem to be solved, but a weight to be carried. On the fourth day, Jake finally asked about the pills. They were sitting in their usual booth, Harold's hands wrapped around his coffee cup for warmth, when Jake nodded toward his jacket pocket. You've been fiddling with that bottle since we sat down. You going to take them, or just rattle them around? Harold looked down. He hadn't realized he'd been doing it. The orange prescription bottle, half empty, clutched in his hand like a worry stone. Blood pressure. I'm supposed to take it in the morning, but I can't remember if I already did. So take it again. Better safe than sorry. That's not how blood pressure medication works. Take too much, and your heart goes haywire. Harold shoved the bottle back in his pocket. Maggie used to handle all this. She had a system, little plastic boxes with the days of the week, alarms on her phone, notes on the refrigerator. I told her she was being ridiculous. Turns out I was the ridiculous one. Jake was quiet for a moment. You got someone who can help? Family? A son. David. He lives in Minneapolis. Harold's voice flattened. He wants me to move into a facility. Assisted living, he calls it. Has pamphlets and everything. Showed me pictures of old people playing bingo and doing water aerobics, like that's supposed to make me feel better about losing my home. Is that what he wants, or what he thinks you need? The question landed harder than Harold expected. He thought about David's voicemails, the worry underneath the frustration, the fear underneath the anger. His son wasn't a bad man. He was just scared, the way children got scared when they realized their parents were mortal. Both, probably, Harold admitted. He's not wrong that I'm struggling. He stopped, searching for words that didn't make him sound like a stubborn old fool. That house is the last place I had with her. Every room, every piece of furniture, every scratch on the floor. She's in all of it. If I leave, I lose her all over again. Jake nodded slowly. I sold my house after Lily died. Couldn't stand walking past her room every day. Thought if I got rid of the place, the memories would go with it. He took a long drink of coffee. They didn't. They just followed me. But by then the house was gone, and I had nothing left but a motorcycle and a storage unit. You're not exactly selling me on the benefits of moving. I'm not trying to. I'm saying there's no right answer. You stay, and the memories are everywhere. You leave, and they're nowhere. Either way, you carry them. Harold looked out the window at the lake, steel gray under the October sky. A fishing boat was heading out despite the weather, its hull cutting through the chop with the stubbornness of men who had work to do, regardless of what the world threw at them. He'd been that man once. Now he couldn't even remember to take his pills. The bell over the diner door jingled. Harold glanced up and felt his stomach drop. David Evanston stood in the entrance, his city coat too thin for the weather, his face a mixture of relief and anger that Harold knew all too well. He spotted his father immediately and crossed to the diner in 5 long strides. 4 days, David said, his voice tight. 4 days without a single returned call. I was about to call the police. Dad, I thought you were dead. I'm not dead. I'm having breakfast. With who? David looked at Jake, taking in the leather vest, the beard, the tattoos visible at his collar. His expression shifted to something warier. Who's this? A friend. Harold didn't elaborate. A friend. David's tone made it clear what he thought of that. Dad, can we talk? Alone? Jake was already sliding out of the booth. I'll wait outside. You don't have to. Harold started, but Jake was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. Through the window, Harold watched him lean against his bike and light a cigarette, his eyes on the lake. David sat down across from his father, his shoulders tight with the tension of a conversation he'd clearly rehearsed. Dad, we need to talk about what's happening here. Nothing's happening. I'm living my life. You're not living, you're surviving. Barely. David pulled a folder from his bag. More pamphlets, Harold saw, more glossy photos of smiling seniors in matching tracksuits. I talked to Dr. Hendricks. He said you've missed your last 3 appointments. Your prescriptions are out of refills because you haven't called them in. The neighbors say you barely leave the house except to go to the cemetery. The neighbors should mind their own business. They're worried about you. I'm worried about you. David's voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, Harold saw the boy underneath the man, the 8-year-old who'd cried when his goldfish died, the teenager who'd hidden his fear behind anger when his mother was first diagnosed. Mom's gone, Dad. I know that's hard, but you can't just disappear into grief and pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist. Harold's jaw tightened. I'm not pretending anything. I'm mourning my wife, the woman I spent 61 years with. Forgive me if I'm not over it in 4 months. I'm not asking you to be over it. I'm asking you to let me help. By putting me in a home? By making sure you don't kill yourself with stubbornness. David's voice rose, drawing glances from the waitress. He lowered it with visible effort. The house is falling apart. The furnace hasn't been serviced in 2 years. There's a leak in the roof that Mom was apparently patching with buckets because you refused to call a repairman. You're not eating properly, you're not taking your medications, and you're spending every morning sitting in a frozen cemetery talking to a headstone. That headstone is your mother. That headstone is a piece of granite. Mom is gone. David's eyes were wet now, and Harold realized with a shock that his son was crying, not sobbing, just a slow leak of tears he didn't seem to notice. She's gone, Dad, and I can't lose you too. Not like this, not watching you fade away in a house full of ghosts. The anger drained out of Harold's chest, leaving something hollow in its place. He looked at his son, really looked, for the first time in months, and saw the exhaustion, the fear, the desperate love that he'd mistaken for control. David, he said quietly, I'm not trying to hurt you. Then let me help, please. David pushed the folder across the table. There's a place in Duluth. Nice place, not what you're picturing. Private apartments, not shared rooms. You could have your own furniture, your own routine, and I could visit every weekend instead of driving 5 hours and praying I don't find you dead on the floor. Harold didn't open the folder. He couldn't, not yet, not with his son watching. I need time. How much time? I don't know. A week, maybe more. He met David's eyes. I'll think about it, really think, not just pretend, but I can't make this decision with you standing over me. David hesitated. Harold could see him weighing the options, push harder and risk a fight, or back off and risk being ignored. Finally, he nodded. 1 week, and you have to answer your phone when I call. Fine. And you'll see Dr. Hendricks. Fine. David stood, buttoning his thin coat. Who is that guy? The one with the motorcycle. Harold glanced out the window. Jake was still there, watching the water, giving them space. Just someone I met at the cemetery. He lost his daughter. We keep each other company. Something shifted in David's face, a flicker of understanding maybe, or at least a pause in his judgment. Be careful, Dad. You don't know anything about him. I know enough. David left without another word. Harold watched him drive away, his rental car disappearing down the lakeside road. A moment later, Jake slid back into the booth. Everything okay? No. Harold finally looked at the folder, at the glossy photos of the facility in Duluth. Clean rooms, handrails, smiling nurses. My son wants to take me away from the only home I've ever known. He thinks it's for my own good. What do you think? Harold was quiet for a long time. Outside, the fishing boat was heading back to shore, its work done for the day. The lake was turning darker as the clouds thickened, a storm building somewhere out over the water. I think I'm tired, he finally said. I think I've been tired for a long time and I don't know how to stop. Jake nodded. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He just sat there, solid and present, as the first drops of rain began to streak the window. Same time tomorrow? He asked. Harold looked at him, this stranger who had somehow become less of a stranger than his own son, and felt something loosen in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Same time tomorrow. The storm came in hard that night, winds off the lake rattling Harold's windows and driving rain sideways against the old clapboard siding. He lay in bed listening to it, the way he used to listen with Margaret beside him, her hand finding his under the covers whenever the thunder got too close. Now there was just the empty space where she'd been, cold sheets and colder memories. At 3 a.m, the furnace died. Harold woke to his own breath fogging in the darkness, the house silent in a way it shouldn't have been. He fumbled for the lamp, found the switch, and nothing happened. Power was out, the whole street probably, from the look of the darkness outside his window. That happened sometimes during storms, but the furnace should have kept running on its pilot light, should have kept the house warm enough to survive until morning. He got out of bed, his joints screaming in protest, and made his way downstairs in the dark. The basement stairs were treacherous, and he held the railing with both hands, feeling each step before committing his weight. The furnace sat in the corner like a dead animal, cold and silent. He didn't know enough about furnaces to diagnose the problem. That had always been Margaret's territory. She'd grown up on a farm, understood machinery in ways he never had. The temperature dropped steadily. By 4:30, Harold could see his breath in the kitchen. By 5, his fingers were too numb to work the buttons on his phone. He wrapped himself in blankets and sat in his chair, watching the window for the first gray light of dawn, trying to remember if hypothermia made you sleepy or if that was something else. He must have drifted off because the next thing he knew, someone was pounding on the front door. Harold! Harold! Open up! Jake's voice. Harold tried to stand and found his legs wouldn't cooperate. The cold had settled into his bones, into his muscles, into whatever mechanism told his body how to move. He opened his mouth to call out and only managed a thin wheeze. The door burst open. Jake stood in the frame, rain dripping from his beard, his eyes going wide as he took in the scene. The old man wrapped in blankets, the fog of his breath, the deadly stillness of a house without heat. Jesus Christ! Jake was across the room in 3 strides, his hands on Harold's face, checking his eyes. How long have you been like this? Furnace, Harold managed, died. Power's out. Power came back 2 hours ago. I drove past and saw your lights were still off. Jake was already pulling out his phone. I'm calling an ambulance. No. Harold grabbed his wrist with what little strength he had. No ambulance? No hospital? They'll use it against me. David will use it. Harold, you're hypothermic. You could have died. I didn't. He forced himself to meet Jake's eyes. Help me get warm. That's all I need. Just help me get warm. Jake hesitated, the phone in his hand, the decision written across his face. Then he shoved the phone back in his pocket and went to work. He found the breaker box and reset it, bringing the lights back on. He found the emergency number for the furnace company and left a message that would have blistered paint. He boiled water for tea and wrapped Harold in every blanket he could find and sat beside him on the couch, his own body heat radiating through the layers. By 7 o'clock, Harold's shivering had stopped. By 8, the furnace repair truck had arrived, a gruff man named Pete, who spent 20 minutes in the basement and emerged with a diagnosis that made him shake his head. Whole system needs replacing, he said. It's 30 years old and held together with duct tape. I can get it running for now, but you're looking at maybe a month before it dies for good. And that's if we don't get another cold snap. How much for a new one? Installed? 9,000. More if the ductwork needs updating. Harold closed his eyes. $8,000 he didn't have. 9,000 reasons his son was right. After Pete left, Jake sat down across from him. You can't stay here. Not like this. I know. So what are you going to do? Harold looked around the living room. Margaret's curtains, Margaret's photographs, the chair where she'd sat every evening doing crossword puzzles while he read the newspaper. 61 years of accumulated life, and it all came down to a broken furnace and an old man who couldn't keep himself warm. I don't know, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in months. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone again. Not to call 911 this time, but to scroll through his contacts. I told you I was in the Marines, he said. What I didn't tell you is that I ride with the Northern Veterans, MC. About 40 guys, most of us combat vets, all of us looking for ways to be useful when civilian life doesn't make sense. He looked up. We do charity rides, fundraisers. Sometimes we just show up when someone needs hands and backs and a reason to believe people give a damn. I'm not a charity case. No, you're a Korean War veteran who held the line at Chosin while the rest of the world was still figuring out what communism meant. You're a man who loved his wife for 61 years and doesn't know how to live without her. And you're sitting in a frozen house because you're too proud to ask for help. Jake's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, an urgency that hadn't been there before. I've watched a lot of men die from pride, Harold, in Fallujah, in VA hospitals, in their own homes with their own guns. I'm not going to watch it happen to you. The words hit Harold like a physical blow. He thought about the pills he kept forgetting, the meals he kept skipping, the way he sometimes sat in his truck in the cemetery parking lot and thought about how easy it would be to just stop. He'd never called it what it was. He'd never let himself name the shape of the thing that had been following him since Margaret's funeral. I don't know how to do this, he said, his voice cracking. I don't know how to be the one who's left. Neither do I. Jake leaned forward. But I know you don't have to figure it out alone. And I know there are 40 men who would ride through a blizzard to help a brother in need, if you'd let them. Harold's hands were shaking, not from cold this time, but from something else, something that felt dangerously close to surrender. What would they even do? Fix your furnace, patch your roof, set up a system for your medications so you don't have to remember what your wife remembered for you. Jake's jaw tightened. Show your son that there's another option besides a facility in Duluth, that you have people, that you're not alone. And if it's not enough, if David still insists, then at least you'll know you tried. At least you'll have fought for it. Jake stood, moving toward the door. Your son's coming back in 4 days. Let me make some calls. Let me see what's possible. Harold sat in his chair, wrapped in blankets, looking at the house that Margaret had made into a home. The photographs on the mantel, their wedding day, David's birth, the grandchildren who called him Pop Pop and visited every Christmas until the last one, when Margaret had been too sick to host, the cross-stitched sampler above the fireplace that Margaret's mother had made. Home is where the heart rests. His heart was here. It had always been here. Make your calls, he said. Jake nodded once and stepped out into the cold October morning. A moment later, Harold heard his bike roar to life, then fade into the distance as he rode toward town. The furnace clanked and groaned in the basement, fighting to stay alive for another month. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the sky washed clean and pale. Harold looked at the phone in his hand, David's number on the screen, his son's worried face in the contact photo. He pressed call. Dad! David's voice was sharp with alarm. What's wrong? Are you okay? I'm okay, Harold said. But I need to tell you something. The furnace died last night. He stopped. Started again. I need help, David. I know I said I didn't, but I do. I just need you to let me try something first. Give me until the end of the week. If it doesn't work, I'll go to Duluth. I'll look at the facility. I'll do it your way. A long silence. Then David's voice, quieter than before. What are you trying, Dad? Harold looked out the window at the road where Jake's bike had disappeared. 40 men. 40 chances to prove that home was still possible. I'm trying to let people in, he said. Your mother always said I was terrible at that. Maybe it's time I learned. They came on Saturday morning, when the October sun was just breaking over Lake Superior, and the frost on the grass glittered like scattered diamonds. Harold heard them before he saw them, the low thunder of engines rolling down Maple Street, growing louder, multiplying. He stood at the front window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands and watched them come. A convoy of motorcycles turning onto his street, filling the block, spilling onto the lawn and the sidewalk and the driveways of neighbors who came out on their porches to stare. 43 bikes. He counted twice to make sure. They cut their engines one by one, and the silence that followed felt like the silence after artillery. Heavy, charged, waiting. Men dismounted and stretched road-stiff legs, a few women too, their faces weathered by wind and years. They wore leather vests with patches Harold recognized from his own service days. Unit insignias, deployment ribbons, the particular iconography of people who had been to war and come back changed. Jake was at the front. He walked up the porch steps and stood beside Harold, looking out at the assembled riders. "Told you they'd come. I didn't believe you." "I know." Jake raised his voice, addressing the crowd. "Listen up. This is Harold Evanston, Corporal, 1st Cav, Korea. He held the line at Chosin when half his unit froze to death and the other half was too stubborn to quit. He's been married 61 years, widowed 4 months, and he's about to lose his home because a furnace and a roof and a system designed to help people has decided he's not worth the trouble." He paused. "We're going to show them they're wrong." A murmur went through the crowd, not dissent, but agreement. Harold saw nods, saw hands reaching for tool belts and work gloves. These weren't men who needed speeches. They just needed direction. "Roof crew, you're with Mackie. He's got the shingles and the tar in his trailer. Furnace crew, Pete from Superior Heating is meeting you in the basement." Yeah, same Pete who told Harold the system was shot. Turns out he's got a brother who's a ranger, and he's donating the labor if we cover the parts. Jake pointed to a third group. "Interior crew, you're on household repairs. Whatever needs fixing, doors, windows, plumbing, we're getting it done today. And someone find the man's medication list, because we're setting up a system that doesn't require him to remember what day it is." The crowd dispersed with military efficiency. Within minutes, Harold's house was swarming with activity, ladders going up against the siding, tools clanking in the basement, voices calling measurements and requests. A woman named Reese took over his kitchen and started making sandwiches for the crew. A man named Tucker sat him down at the dining table with his pill bottles and a notebook, asking questions about dosages and schedules with the patience of someone who had done this before. "My dad had Alzheimer's," Tucker explained, organizing the bottles by time of day. "We went through 6 different systems before we found one that worked. Pill organizers, phone alarms, a whiteboard by the bed. It's not complicated once you set it up. It just takes someone who gives a damn." Harold watched him work and felt something crack in his chest. Not pain, but the release of pressure he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. He'd spent 4 months telling himself he had to handle this alone, that asking for help was weakness, that Margaret's death had severed the last connection he had to people who cared. And here were 43 strangers proving him wrong. The morning passed in a blur of noise and progress. By noon, the new furnace was installed and rumbling to life in the basement. By 2, half the roof had been reshingled. By 4, the house looked better than it had in years. Gutters cleaned, windows caulked, the porch railing that had been loose since last winter finally secured. Harold walked through the rooms in a daze, touching walls that had been patched, running his hand along trim that had been repainted. In the kitchen, someone had fixed the cabinet door that wouldn't close. In the bathroom, the leak under the sink was gone. Small things, invisible things, the accumulated neglect of a man who had stopped noticing what was falling apart around him. He ended up in the living room, standing in front of the mantel, where Margaret's photographs still held their places, their wedding day, David's birth, the grandchildren. 61 years of accumulated life, and strangers had spent a day preserving it, because one of their own had asked them to. "Harold," he turned. Jake stood in the doorway, his face smudged with dust, his hands black with furnace grease. "There's someone here to see you." David's rental car was parked at the curb, wedged between 2 motorcycles. His son stood on the sidewalk, staring at the chaos of activity with an expression Harold couldn't read. When he saw his father, On the porch, he walked forward slowly, picking his way through tool bags and lumber scraps. "Dad." David's voice was careful, controlled. "What is all this?" "Help," Harold said simply. "The kind I should have asked for months ago." David looked at the roof crew packing up their ladders, at the furnace truck pulling away from the curb, at the men and women in leather vests who nodded at him as they passed. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite get out. "I drove up to tell you I'd made a decision," he finally said. "I was going to say that waiting a week was too long, that I'd called the facility in Duluth and put down a deposit." He shook his head. "But this, I don't understand this." "Neither do I." Harold came down the porch steps, moving easier than he had in weeks. Tucker's medication system was already working, the right pills at the right times, making a difference he hadn't expected. "But I'm starting to. These people, they don't owe me anything. They came because one man asked them to, and that man came because I bought him a cup of coffee when he was grieving." He met his son's eyes. "Your mother used to say that kindness compounds. You put a little out into the world, and it comes back bigger than you sent it. I never really believed her. I think I believe her now." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "The furnace, did they actually fix it?" "Brand new unit. Pete donated the labor, the club covered the parts. Roof's done too, and the gutters, and about a dozen other things I didn't even know were broken." "And the medications, you're taking them properly?" "Tucker, the big guy with the beard, he set up a whole system. Pill boxes, phone reminders, a chart on the refrigerator." Harold almost smiled. "He said his dad had Alzheimer's. He knows what he's doing." David looked at the house, really looked, the way he hadn't in years, taking in the fresh paint on the trim, the new shingles on the roof, the general air of a place that had been cared for instead of slowly abandoned. "This doesn't solve everything," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "You're still 82. You're still alone. What happens the next time something breaks?" "I pick up the phone." Harold pulled out the card Jake had given him, worn now, creased from being carried in his pocket. "I've got 43 numbers in my contacts that weren't there a week ago, and I've got a standing invitation to coffee every morning from a man who lost his daughter and doesn't want to watch anyone else fade away." Jake had come out onto the porch, keeping his distance, giving them space. David looked at him for a long moment, then walked over and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, "for whatever you did, for being there when I couldn't be." Jake shook it. "Your father's a good man. He just forgot that good men don't have to be strong alone." David turned back to Harold. The anger was gone from his face, not replaced by acceptance, exactly, but by something more complicated. The recognition that control was an illusion, that the best you could do was show up and hope it was enough. "I'm not canceling the deposit in Duluth," he said. "Not yet, but I'll hold off. We'll see how this goes." "That's all I'm asking. And you'll call me every day, even if it's just to complain about the weather." "Every day." David pulled him into a hug, awkward, the way hugs between fathers and sons often were, but real. Harold held on longer than he expected to, feeling his son's heartbeat against his chest, remembering a time when David had been small enough to carry. "Mom would be furious with both of us," David said into his shoulder, "fighting about this for months when we should have been helping each other." "She'd be furious," Harold agreed, "and then she'd make us tamales and tell us to stop being idiots." David laughed, a wet, surprised sound. "Yeah, she would." They stood together on the lawn as the last of the Northern Veterans MC packed up their gear. Engines rumbled to life one by one, and the convoy began to pull away. Each rider raised a hand as they passed. Not quite a salute, but something close. Harold raised his hand in return. Jake was the last to go. He stood beside his Harley, helmet in hand, looking at Harold with an expression that was hard to read. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "The cemetery, I mean." Harold thought about Margaret's headstone on the hill, about the cold wind off the lake, about the folding chair he'd been sitting in every morning for 4 months. He'd go back. He'd always go back. But maybe it didn't have to be the only place he went. "Same time tomorrow," he said, "and then breakfast. My treat this time." Jake smiled, the first real smile Harold had seen from him. "Deal." He kicked the bike to life and rode off down Maple Street, the rumble of his engine fading into the October afternoon. Harold watched until he disappeared around the corner, then turned and looked at his house. Margaret's cross-stitch sampler was visible through the front window, the words she'd hung there 30 years ago. Home is where the heart rests. His heart was still here, and now so were the people who would help him keep it. Winter came early to Lake Superior that year, the first real snow falling 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Harold woke to a white world outside his window, the trees along Maple Street heavy with it, the lake invisible behind a curtain of gray. The furnace hummed steadily in the basement, that new, reliable sound he was still getting used to, and the house held its warmth like a promise kept. He went through his morning routine without thinking about it now. Pills from the Tuesday compartment of his organizer, coffee from the pot he'd learned to set the night before. A glance at the whiteboard on the refrigerator, where Tucker's neat handwriting reminded him of his doctor's appointment next week, the grocery list he needed to finish, the phone call to David scheduled for noon. David called every day now, just like he'd promised. Sometimes they talked for an hour, sometimes just 5 minutes. Weather reports and small complaints, the ordinary currency of family. The Duluth brochures had gone back in the drawer, unopened, not forgotten exactly, just waiting. A contingency plan rather than an inevitability. At 7 o'clock, Harold pulled on his coat and boots and drove to the cemetery. The snow had softened everything, rounding the edges of the headstones and muffling the wind that came off the water. Harold brushed the accumulation from Margaret's granite marker and set up his folding chair, the legs sinking slightly into the white. His breath fogged in the cold air, but it was a different cold than the night the furnace died. A cold he'd chosen, a cold he was prepared for. First snow of the season, Maggie. You always did love how it looked on the lake. He pulled his collar tighter. David's coming up for Thanksgiving, bringing the grandkids. I'm supposed to make your stuffing recipe, which means I'm going to mess it up, and everyone's going to pretend it's fine. You'd get a kick out of that. The wind answered. It always did, but the silence didn't feel as heavy anymore. A motorcycle rumbled into the parking lot, that familiar sound that had become part of his mornings. Jake cut the engine and walked through the snow, his boots leaving dark prints in the white. He stopped at Lily's grave, brushed the snow from her headstone with his bare hand, and stood there for a long moment before coming over to stand beside Harold. Cold one, Jake said, getting colder. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow drift down over the graves. This was their routine now, cemetery at 7, diner at 8, sometimes errands or repairs, or just driving around the lake talking about nothing in particular. Jake had extended his stay through November, then December. He'd found a room at the boarding house on 3rd Street, picked up work at the mechanics shop in town, started showing up at the VFW on Friday nights, where the old-timers were slowly accepting him as one of their own. I talked to my ex-wife yesterday, Jake said, breaking the silence. First time in 2 years. Harold looked at him. How'd that go? Awkward, painful. Jake's jaw tightened. She's remarried, lives in Oregon now, has a stepson she's helping raise. He was quiet for a moment. She said she doesn't blame me anymore. For Lily, said she realized a long time ago that blame was just another way of holding on to grief, and she had to let it go to survive. What did you say? I said I was glad she found peace, and I meant it. Jake's voice was rough. I'm not there yet. Maybe I never will be. But talking to her, it felt like putting down something I'd been carrying too long. Not the grief. That stays. But the guilt. The idea that I don't deserve to keep living because she didn't. Harold thought about his own guilt. The years he'd spent on the road with the first Cav instead of home with Margaret. The missed anniversaries and forgotten birthdays. The slow accumulation of absences that he'd tried to make up for in the decades after. You couldn't balance that ledger. You could only keep showing up and hope the showing up mattered more than the times you didn't. Maggie used to say that guilt was just love with nowhere to go, he said. She told me to stop carrying it around and start putting it to use instead. It took me 40 years to figure out what she meant. What did she mean? Harold looked at Jake, this man who had stopped at a cemetery on a cold October morning and refused to let a stranger fade away. She meant that the people we've lost don't want us to suffer. They want us to live, and the best way to honor them is to take all that love we can't give them anymore and give it to someone else instead. Jake was quiet for a long time. The snow kept falling, covering Lily's headstone again, covering Margaret's, covering the whole hill in white. I've been thinking about staying, he finally said. Through the winter, maybe longer. The shop offered me full-time work, and there's a veteran support group at the church that could use another voice. He glanced at Harold. If that's not overstepping. Overstepping would be leaving. Harold pushed himself up from the chair, his knees protesting the cold. Come on. Diner's got that pot roast special on Tuesdays. I'm buying. They walked back to the parking lot together, the old man and the younger one, their footprints side by side in the fresh snow. Jake's Harley sat next to Harold's pickup, chrome frosted white, waiting. Same time tomorrow, Jake asked. Harold looked back at the cemetery, at the 2 headstones on the hill, at the snow that would keep falling long after they were gone. Margaret was here. Lily was here. The grief would never leave entirely, and that was as it should be. But grief shared was grief halved, and love given was love multiplied, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being a man who attended his wife's grave alone. Same time tomorrow, he said. The engine caught on the first try. Jake lifted a hand as he pulled onto the road, and Harold lifted his in return. Then he climbed into his truck, turned on the heater, and followed the motorcycle toward town. The diner was warm, the coffee was hot, and outside the window, the snow kept falling on a world that was quieter than it used to be, but no longer empty. If this story moved you, subscribe so you never miss one. And tell us in the comments who has stood beside you in your hardest moments. We read everyone.